I'm not here yet.
Okay, well, welcome everyone to Ask the Experts webinar series. This webinar is about youth in the criminal justice system, and this is the 6th webinar in the Student Alliance for Prison Reform's webinar series. My name is Carsen Nies. I'll be moderating today. I am from the University of Puget Sound, for which I'm a member of the Student Alliance for Prison Reform. And I'm lucky enough to be joined today by Matt Washchuk, who is a juvenile defense attorney from Sacks Goetz law firm in Portland, Oregon. Mary Kane, who's also a juvenile defense attorney from Youth Rights and Justice in Portland, Oregon. Jessica Sandoval, the vice president and deputy director at the Campaign for Youth Justice, and Vanessa Hernandez, who's the youth policy director for the ACLU of Washington State. So thank you all so much for being here today. Sorry for the technical difficulties to begin, but would you all mind starting off by giving a brief introduction of what it is you do exactly in the particular work you do with youth in the criminal justice system? We could start with Vanessa, perhaps.
Sure. So I am the Youth Policy Director with the ACLU of Washington. I actually have only recently taken that position over, so I've been doing the work for about 2 months now. My project focuses on the intersections of the education and juvenile justice systems. We're working right now primarily on issues involving the school-to-prison pipeline and school discipline, and also looking at young adult issues in the criminal justice system, so folks in that sort of 18 to 25 bandwidth who've been left out of our traditional conversations about how we treat young people.
Great, thank you. Matt, do you want to go next?
Sure. So I'm at Washchuk at Sacks Goetz. I'm an attorney, and for about the last 5 years, the way I've represented juveniles in delinquency cases is that if children are accused of committing what would be crimes for adults in Multnomah County in Oregon, then and the state chooses to prosecute those children in juvenile court as opposed to adult court, I may get appointed to represent those children as indigent cases, and I represent them in both misdemeanor and felony cases, from basic thefts all the way up to Class A felonies. And that will go throughout the process of adjudicating the petition as to whether or not they're guilty of committing the crimes, as well as representing them in probation hearings, revocation hearings, or even reviews kind of as it relates to placement, where they're living, what kind of services they're engaged in, either in terms of rehabilitation or simply as kind of child or social development issues for them as well.
Cool, thank you. Mary, do you want to go next?
I do what Matt does. Okay. I've been doing delinquents, this as has been described by Matt, the same kind of delinquency work at Multnomah County. I also, I think as a result of doing it for so many years, I kind of put my toe in sort of some of the policy work, and I'm currently on a it's a task force that was put together by Chief Justice Balmer in September of 2014 to look at mental health, juveniles with mental health needs who end up in incarcerated or corrections facilities, and looking at how we can do it better. Why are they there? What gets them there? What are alternatives to that? What can we create, or what recommendations can we make to take the kids going down that route another way, looking at addressing their mental health needs as such, and not as kind of a secondary issue to their delinquent behavior.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And then Jessica.
Hi, good evening. Jessica Sandoval here with the Campaign for Youth Justice, and we're a national initiative with the mission really to end the prosecution of youth under 18 in the adult criminal justice system. And we do that really by providing technical assistance to states who are interested in leading campaign efforts to remove kids from the adult court. and we also have some federal initiatives that I'll talk about a little bit later, the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act being one of them, as well as the Prison Rape Elimination Act.
Great. Thank you all. Thank you so much for those introductions. Again, we're so privileged and lucky to have you here. We're going to start by delving into more information about youth in the criminal justice system. Wanted to just briefly give our viewers some information about these particular youth. So it is estimated that 250,000 youth are tried, sentenced, or incarcerated as adults every year in the U.S. Most of these youth prosecuted in adult court are charged with nonviolent offenses. These large numbers of incarcerated youth feed into our country's incredible rates of mass incarceration. As a lot of our viewers probably know, though, the U.S. is home to only 5% of the world's population. We hold around 25% of the world's prison population, with an incarceration rate of around 716 people for every 100,000 residents. So for these reasons, it seems that there's no better time than now to discuss the ramifications of incarcerating youth in our criminal justice system. To begin, I've prepared some specific questions for each of our panelists today. I kind of wanted to start with Matt and his legal work with youth in the criminal justice system, but I do want to clarify that although these questions are more specific to each panelist, if anyone has an inclination to say something or they have something to add, please do not hesitate to do that. So Matt, to begin, out of the youth you have represented in juvenile delinquency cases, what is the typical demographic in terms of ethnicity and socioeconomic status of these youth?
Well, virtually every youth is poor, and I would say that the majority of kids that I represent do not come from homes that have a typical nuclear family. Usually they come from homes where you have one or two parents who have multiple children, who really the parents struggle economically. Often the parents struggle with having some issues that prevent them from being able to really help children who are on the edge of being in the criminal justice system avoid that. And so there are some disadvantages there. In terms of demographics, I certainly have represented kids who are, Caucasian, Hispanic, African American. I think I've had a single client who's been Asian. The vast majority of my clients are, I would say, African American, but I definitely represent also Hispanics and Caucasians. I mean, the real, I would say the real common trait is that they generally are poor, they have few resources, and that means not only that they have few legal defense resources, which is why they get me as an attorney who's going to represent them with state funding, but they also have few resources to be engaged in pro-social activities or services that would help them be on a path that would prevent them from being likely to engage in behavior that could call into question whether they're violating the law. They could be in areas of town that are not going to be gun or other criminal hotspots, and therefore avoiding common contact with police. For me, I certainly think poverty is one of the biggest factors, and then that extends not just that the child is poor, but the family is poor, so that the parents have few resources both to prevent this and to assist their children.
Mary, do you kind of see a similar trend with?
Absolutely. I think it's, and I think the juvenile departments have at least here in Multnomah County, have found that they need to look at the kind of the halo of environmental, family, and other factors, because that directly leads to whether kids are kind of getting it, piercing, as we call it, excuse me, the delinquent system. And so I have found where it's families who are struggling, and so often there's a fair amount of chaos, or the kids are raising themselves in some respect, or they're in areas where there's high poverty, high crime rate. That there are a lot of stressors on the youth and on the family, and very few, and in my 18 years, fewer and fewer resources to help them.
Right. Okay. Thank you for that. So, Matt, along with the issue of poverty, do you find that there are other underlying catalysts in the cases that you handle that tend to lead clients to commit crimes? Like, do you see drug addiction as a primary catalyst of property crimes, or is it often issues of poverty?
Well, I mean, there's certainly both.
Right.
There are some of the youth that I represent certainly have drug addictions, or if not addictions, dependence or common use that is helping to contribute to some of the behavior. Often that comes from either siblings who are using or parents who are using, and so it's part of the family culture that's acceptable. Mm-hmm. And can be troubling for them. Certainly, I think there are some youth who are involved in property crimes because of gang affiliation or simply social affiliation, where there's a lot of pressure to engage in the behavior. It is very easy for a child to commit a robbery where they go into a supermarket and they pick out a pack of chips or gum, and they run out of the store, and on the way out they bump into someone who works at the store. Now they've used force and they've stolen something, and therefore they now have committed a serious felony. And this is a child who simply is poor and hungry and picked up some snacks and decided to run out of the store. I think there are other periods of time or other situations in which it could be handled very differently, but here the police are very willing to send a number of officers out to track down the youth, arrest him or her, put him in juvenile detention, and charge him with a serious felony, which then will start the process of engaging the child in the criminal justice system and probation, really for what has never been intended to be a serious criminal act by the youth. Well, I guess I'd leave it there.
Okay. Thank you. Kind of going off of the influence of education and home life on youth's criminal activity, I want to ask Jessica more about the school-to-prison pipeline trend. Can you kind of give our viewers a description of what the school-to-prison pipeline is and discuss that a little bit?
I think, Carsen, you might mean Vanessa.
Oh, sorry. I did mean Vanessa. I'm sorry if I said Jessica.
That's totally all right. So the school-to-prison pipeline is a term that's used to describe a whole host of practices that push kids out of schools and out of their learning environments and into the juvenile justice system. It's a way that we as a society deal with adolescent misconduct, not by teaching children, but by jailing them. And I think it really has their sort of direct school-to-prison pipeline and indirect school-to-prison pipeline. The indirect school-to-prison pipeline is really the practice of suspending and expelling kids in large numbers. And that leads to juvenile justice involvement because kids who are out of school, lacking positive influences and lacking supports are much more likely to engage in problematic behavior and end up, in the juvenile justice system that way. We know that kids who are suspended and expelled are also much more likely to be to drop out of school, which again tends to lead to juvenile justice involvement. But there's also a really troubling phenomenon of what I just called straight direct school-to-prison pipeline, which is kids being arrested on campus for school-based misbehavior that never should be involved in the juvenile justice system in the first place. The most sort of clear and horrific example of this recently was in South Carolina, where there's a horrible video of a young woman being arrested by a police officer. Actually, there were two arrests that day. There was the arrest of the young woman who refused to put her cell phone away and was violently arrested by an officer for the crime of disrupting school. And then the young woman who filmed the incident and questioned the officer's behavior also being arrested and charged with the crime of disrupting school. And so we see that increasingly now, that kind of direct, where instead of dealing with school problems at school, they are now being funneled into the juvenile justice system.
Right. Right.
And can I just, I have one example that's, I inherited a case that my client moved up from Texas, where that exact practice occurred, and in which this kid, it was fetal alcohol, developmentally delayed, and so had impulse control problems and was in a special ed class. But because he was having trouble with his impulsivity, he ended up, and this was the practice there, being brought before a judge, where he would get harassment charges, and by the time I got him in Oregon, he had racked up about $1,700 in court fees. Somebody with an IQ of about 52, who was not really going to be working, and it was incomprehensible to me. But it's the practice down there.
Wow. Crazy. Okay. Thank you for sharing. Vanessa, do you have any insight as to why there's been an increase on police reliance in school hallways? Or?
I mean, I think there's a whole host of factors, right, that people point to. I think one is a lack of resources, right? There's, you know, I mean, I've been a teacher, and I've been a teacher in high poverty, you know, sort of low resource school districts, and I think that oftentimes the culture of certain schools, of certain districts, really is let's just push the bad kids out, right? We don't have any way to deal with these kids, so let's just get them out of our building because we have enough going on. I think there's also a lot of pressure on schools. Increasingly, there's you know, the federal government and state and local governments often fund and push schools to incentivize schools to let police in. And I think, again, for resource-starved jurisdictions, the idea of having another person on staff to help approach this behavior is attractive to educators. There's fears about school safety, and I also think, you know, increasingly there are a lot of concerns about a culture of sort of policing in education generally, the sort of zero tolerance, no misbehavior whatsoever, strong consequences idea often lends itself to adopting a law enforcement sort of mindset.
Do you see an issue with youth trying to re-enter the education system post incarceration or post time in the criminal justice system?
So that's something that varies dramatically jurisdiction by jurisdiction, but yes, it is very, very hard for kids who've been involved in the juvenile justice system to get back into sort of full traditional education services. In some districts, as soon as a child spends a day in juvenile detention, they are automatically disenrolled from the school and then have to basically petition to get re-enrolled. Those disruptions take time and take energy and often lead to kids dropping out. School districts also often will expel students on their way to the juvenile justice system, right? Because of what the one instance of misconduct will carry dual consequences, both the kids going to the juvenile justice system and kids getting expelled from school. And once students are expelled, it's very, very difficult in many jurisdictions for them to get reintegrated. And so without a lot of supportive services, without a lot of commitment, kids often find themselves sort of shut out of the educational process once there's juvenile justice involvement.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you for sharing that. Mary, I wanted to touch upon your work with mentally ill youth who are increasingly becoming incarcerated. Can you discuss why these trends are occurring, that more and more mentally ill youths are incarcerated instead of having their mental illness properly treated?
I think there are multiple factors. I mean, and just to start with the number, nationally it's been estimated that 70% of all youths who are incarcerated have at least one mental health diagnosis. Mm-hmm. So talking about a large number of youths who are who end up there. Part of the work that we've been doing on this task force is trying to identify what led them there and how, and some of the things are And again, this I think goes with the poverty and the resource issues, is that there aren't enough, they aren't being treated in the community. And there's a lot of, the way that mental health works, it's a very disruptive system. You go into, let's say you went into a residential program, you'd have a treatment provider. Once you leave that system, you lose that provider, you lose all that support, so then you have to start again. And so there's this cycling of behavior that leads to more and more instability, which causes kids to get out of control. And so by the time they get out of control, people around them are looking at them saying, well, they're not going to be stable in a foster home, let's put them in detention. So one of the things is the kind of the fractured mental health system for kids. Another is there appears to be a kind of a disconnect between, or a lack of connection between the various agencies who could earlier on identify kids with mental health problems and address them. Some schools can do it. Very few in the population that we're talking about have those resources where they can identify kids with emerging mental health problems at an earlier time, so that they are stable and have by the time they hit 12 and 13, when we typically start seeing the delinquent behavior. So it's that kind of lack of community resources. The kids end up in detention because we haven't really developed those interim crisis placements. We have foster homes, and those are for kids who are, we think are safe in the community, and then there's locked facilities. And there are very few interim places where people are skilled to deal with mental health but allow a kind of a community-based treatment. So I think you're looking at a lot of different factors that lead kids into detention. I think there's also, I think with agencies, the struggle has always been the money. So who pays for it? You have, there's usually comorbid. At least I've noticed that there's comorbid factors, like there'll be mental health, but there's also developmental disabilities, or there's DHS involvement because these kids are dependent youth as well, and people get very protective of their pot of money because it's limited, and so nobody wants to take care of it, the kid, and so he or she ends up in detention. Because there's limited resources, and if they don't have to, they won't pay.
Right. All right. Thank you. What is there a clear increase then, do you see, in recidivism as a result of putting youth in the juvenile detention system if they are mentally ill and not treated properly?
Well, there tends to be, because so they end up staying in detention longer because a couple of things happen. When you put a kid in detention, the facilities aren't staffed to address their mental health needs, right? So you don't have the psychiatrist, you don't have the medication is it's difficult for them to come by because of the reasons I stated before. You can't get their previous treating psychiatrist because they're as soon as a kid enters detention, the funding, their insurance stops. So any funding they had in Oregon is the Oregon Health Plan. That ends as soon as they enter detention. So then it becomes Correction Services that pays for Corrections Health that pays for it. So there's this disruption of services that leads to further instability. So when they do get out, we're often running around. I know Matt is probably doing the same. We run around trying to get them the medications they need, a stable placement, trying to get them the stability that they need, and it's really hard because it can't be designed when they're in detention. We have to wait for them to get out again.
Do you know what the cost is like between having the corrections facilities pay for that versus having funding outside of that? I don't know if you would know.
I don't know. I don't know what the cost difference. I think it's got to be more expensive because you have redundant evaluations, you have a redundant medication. I mean, there are redundancies that needn't be there, but are the way that the system currently is set up.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. This is more catered towards Jessica, but anyone is welcome to comment. As it's clear that there are few programs that are sufficient for youth care within correctional facilities. So what are the dangers that you see youth face in adult facilities if they're being held in adult correctional facilities?
Sure. So we see for young people who are in adult facilities many dangers, one of them being the high risk of suicide along with the risks of sexual abuse. Mm-hmm. And so our research has basically yielded that about kids are about 36 times more likely to commit suicide in an adult facility than if they were in with their peers in a juvenile facility. And also the sexual abuse numbers are equally as high. And so we've been working on the Prison Rape Elimination Act for the last few years now, really to come up with standards that would protect kids who are in adult courts by reducing their interactions with adults, keeping them out of solitary confinement, and really banning them from being in the adult population.
Wow, okay, thank you. Can you comment then on, you mentioned PREA, the Rape and Assault Act, but can you also comment on the federal advocacy initiative that the campaign has been working on?
Sure. So for several years, the Campaign for Youth Justice has been working in concert with many national organizations here in DC in coalition to really look at what the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act says as it is currently written. It's about 35 years old and does need quite a bit of updating. And so our role and goal really was to bring the standards up to involve, or I guess include, young people who have been in the, or who are charged as adults. Currently, the JJDPA only covers young people who are in juvenile court, and so we're asking that the entire bill be amended to basically say that all young people under the age of 18 be included in the law.
Mm-hmm. Great. Is that then the JDPA? Is that also part of the that's part of the National Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Coalition then that you guys?
Correct.
Okay.
Yes, and the Act for Juvenile Justice is a smaller group of folks working on the legislation.
Okay. Thank you. What would you say is the campaign's quote-unquote ideal model for a rehabilitative program for youth as an alternative to incarceration?
Well, we believe that the system should be a very, very small system, treating young people in home-like facilities if they have to be incarcerated. We believe that most children do not need to be incarcerated and are better served in their communities. And there's reinvestments that really can help fund those efforts. So it's not so much a program, but there are things that involve trauma-informed care that really gets to the needs of young people and their families. There's evidence-based programs like multi-systemic therapy and others that really can help bring families and young people together. But we really believe that families need to be involved in the care of their children. And in the adult court, once they're charged as adults, they are no longer, their parents are no longer their parent. And so we really think that they should be much more involved in the treatment of their children.
Great, thank you. Matt, I was wondering if you were talking about how a lot of cases that you have are consequence of having a broken family in a way. What Jessica was just saying about having family support their youth. Can you talk on that about what you would see as an alternate to incarceration for youth who are coming from a broken family and who might not have that support from family members before incarceration?
Well, and of course, I don't mean to say that there's any particular way that a family needs to be structured in order for a child to have success. I think the unfortunate reality is that many children do not have parents who have any resources and are, unfortunately, it does not help youth when they have to deal with the juvenile justice system when their parents are not well-spoken and assertive with the juvenile justice kind of probation officers, judges, and others who could be making decisions on behalf of their children. You know, I would say that everyone who looks at community safety would prefer to, if they felt that parents really could protect both the children and help protect the children from unsafe situations in the community, they would prefer to leave the children in the homes. There is not. I think there are definitely not enough resources for in-home supports. Many of these youth require intensive mental health services that would have service providers coming to the home multiple times per week, working not only with the youth on the youth's own diagnoses, which would likely be anxiety, post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, historical neglect or abuse, and those issues that the child needs to often work on. There's an equal need for the parent to work on the issues, and if you can have intensive services in the home, you can really avoid a situation where the youth is removed from the home, which I think unfortunately is the alternative is if you don't have a home situation that can be maintained, you're punishing the youth by removing the youth from the home, placing them in a residential facility, or if not a residential facility, then one where it's residential light, and really removing the child from natural family supports and as well, neighborly supports, community supports, supports from school, and really treat the child as a problem that needs to be dealt with as a patient rather than a youth who needs some often mental health assistance. Here in Multnomah County, we have a juvenile court, a building dedicated to juvenile cases, and while Mary and I talk about the delinquency cases, going on at the same time are DHS dependency cases where children are removed from homes due to safety concerns from the parents' inability to provide safe care for the children. And really in every delinquency case we have, there's a simultaneous analysis going on of, does DHS need to be involved in this family's lives? Is this parent really a sufficient parent? And I'm being pessimistic here when I say this, but I feel that generally DHS, caseworkers who are in DHS have the goal of saving families, reuniting families, taking care of children who need help, and children who have delinquent charges are viewed as children who are bad, and they are not the ones who are focused on. And DHS does not want to really be caring for children who are in the criminal justice system. The juvenile department really doesn't want DHS, in my opinion, as a partner because it to some degree it humanizes children when you have to see that there's more going on than simply a child committed an act that's a violation of the law. And part of the reason, like when Mary talks about doing evaluations, I do evaluations both because I want my child client to succeed on probation and we need to know what services are really necessary, but also because I need him to be humanized. I need the juvenile department, I need a probation officer, I need DHS to see that this is a youth who has suffered. I mean, most of these children, there is a history to their life that is not one that would naturally lead us to believe that they're going to have great success without some kind of intervention. And it's just much easier to say, here's the black and white issue. You broke the law. You need to do these rehabilitative services and treat the child as a junior adult rather than as a child who really needs to have a more whole family life and one that is free from violence, one that's free from drugs. And that can be difficult to achieve when I think you have people not really wanting to see how much money and time that will cost. And so these services that need to be in the home, these intensive services that need to be there are not enough services available to the children, both while they're on probation, and more importantly, these parents don't have the money or they don't have the knowledge to access these services prior to the children being engaged in the kind of behavior that leads to juvenile court involvement.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Okay. Well, thank you. Vanessa, can you touch upon, too, what the ACLU in particular is trying to do to reform the school-to-prison pipeline, or any cases in which youth are treated as adults, sentenced as adults in the criminal justice system?
So right now we are focusing, I think, as are a lot of people, on trying to think about how we can shift the focus from juvenile justice or criminal justice involvement to community or school-based services to help meet the needs of youth and address, delinquent or sometimes even marginally problematic behavior. So we are doing a lot of work right now on trying to develop what those programs should look like and push for their adoption. We've been really encouraged by the growth of restorative practices or school-based positive behavioral supports in other jurisdictions in Oakland and in Baltimore, where schools have adopted that to great effect in terms of keeping kids in schools and out of the criminal justice system. But I agree with what a lot of folks have said in terms of kids who are involved in the deep end of the juvenile justice system. I think the research is really conclusive that detaining kids in large, detention facilities is not productive. It's deeply, deeply damaging to children, and we know that kids who go through these detention facilities have worse outcomes. They have higher recidivism rates, lower rates of employment, lower rates of educational attainment, and we would do much better to use community-based services, intensive family services. There's been a lot of research that shows that that is more effective, much, much, much more effective for children and families than detaining them in prison-like facilities. So that I think nationally the ACLU has been very involved in trying to move to have youth be considered and not to have young people be in the adult criminal justice system. In Washington, we do still unfortunately have young people based on certain criminal charges being automatically charged as adults and sent through the adult system, and I think that that's misguided. Again, that the vast majority of young people, that youth matters and that kids and young people are amenable to rehabilitation, and our system should be structured toward that end as opposed to a detention and punishment model.
Right. Thank you. I think Jessica had to step away. She emailed that she had a crying baby to attend to, but I was hoping to talk to her a little bit about youth in solitary confinement, but I was wondering if any of you had any insight into what it looks like to place youth in solitary confinement, what the consequences of doing that are. If not, that's okay too. But if anyone has any thoughts on that.
I mean, I can say that, again, I'm not working on this issue personally, but nationally it's an issue that our organization has been working on. And again, the research shows that it is profoundly damaging to put youth in solitary confinement, and it's something that is done often in circumstances where it's absolutely unnecessary, right? Where young people are placed in solitary confinement for their protection. And when young people are placed in solitary confinement because they have mental health issues, and that only exacerbates whatever problems those kids may have going in.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's damaging for adults, and children have much more vulnerable psyches, and when you have 70% of the kids having at least one mental health problem and putting them into isolation like that, you are just permanently damaging a brain that is still developing, still very vulnerable.
And I think to piggyback off of what Vanessa said as well, even if we're not talking about solitary confinement, just a temporary confinement, or even let's say a several-month confinement for a youth in a correctional facility, think about what you're asking. If you really want to provide good care for a child, think about what you're asking a corrections officer to be. You really need a corrections officer to be a mental health counselor, a drug and alcohol addiction counselor, someone who has studied early and late childhood development, someone who has good social skills, and really parenting skills. And that is not the definition of what you're going to find with most corrections officers. And frankly, it would be a different world if each correction officer had either the willingness or the time to have that kind of training. It's very difficult, even in our system, even in Multnomah County, when we have some children in detention where they are receiving some assessment and evaluation. There's a clear distinction for how mental health counselors in detention here will treat a youth versus a general population corrections officer who really has the job of shepherding a youth to and from locations and maintaining peace and order, and can't do so in a way that could in any way be one that could have a method of treatment that's informed by the youth's mental health diagnosis, the youth's social skill set or lack thereof, the youth's understanding for how to either respond verbally or through social cues or through written language. And the reality is we would want anyone dealing with these children to really understand what their needs are and respond in a way that is going to really be fair to that child. And it's not something that can really be achieved unless you're someone who really is an expert in that area, and you can't do that in custody.
Mm-hmm. And I would say that part of the some of the people in the work group that I've been on, including the head of OIA, which is our Oregon Youth Authority, it houses the corrections facility housing facility. They don't want kids with these kind of issues in their program. They recognize very clearly, and they've been OIA has been working with Portland State to pull out the data so they can present and say these are not. We don't have the facility to deal with the mental health issues, the developmental disability issues, the kind of the trauma issues. We don't have that facility to address it in a way that is going to lead to a better youth coming out of corrections. It doesn't. They don't want it. And I mean, I think we're all in agreement. It's a bad place to raise a child. It's a terrible place.
Yeah, Jessica, we were just talking about placing youth in solitary confinement and the ramifications of that. I don't know if you want to add anything to that and how confinement impacts youth's long-term recidivism.
Sure. So what we say, based on the research and the folks that we've talked to, it really does create an atrophying of the brain being in solitary confinement. And so it just either can exacerbate already ongoing issues, of course, and in lots of cases it creates them. And so what happens is when young people are placed in solitary confinement, which many of them are for their safety, 23 hours a day in a small cell locked up with maybe 1 hour out is really really a form of torture is the best way to describe it. And there isn't really any piece of research indicating that solitary confinement is a useful practice at all, particularly for young people. And so I think what we would ultimately like to see is states really updating their laws to reflect what the research says. And the research, no piece of research points to anything positive about the adult court for young people.
Right. Thank you for sharing. We're coming close to the end of the hour, so kind of want to begin wrapping up. We've all touched upon what you're doing in terms of activism for youth who are incarcerated, and I don't know if you have any additional things you would like to add. Mary, I'm kind of curious to learn a little bit more about the committee you're working on to decrease the incarceration of mentally ill youth. If you could talk a little bit more about that.
Well, as I said, it is a task force, and so we are putting together recommendations.
Okay.
And looking at a number of ways, and I think it's been touched on in different areas. I think it comes down to recognizing the environmental things that put kids at risk, and we know them early on. One of the pediatricians who's on this task force said that he knew he knew there'd be mental health problems later on if a child came into his care with a family of neglect, a history of neglect, and with attachment problems. At age 2, he could diagnose a mental health problem in a teenager. And so we know that it happens earlier. Pediatricians are identifying or they're talking about assessing kids at around age 12 because that's when the drug incidence of drug and alcohol, whether experimentation or leading to further problems, and the beginnings of kind of emerging depressions occur. If we can identify earlier and have I think the services, those community services that can address them either in the school, which seems a natural place to try to address kids' problems earlier. So you're trying to support the family, you're trying to identify and then support whatever fragilities that child has, so that you don't have a 12 or 13-year-old who's not received any support, who's not received the kind of help they need to be pro-social members of the community. Instead, we're trying to deal with it in a very reactive way. And I think the idea is to be less reactive and more proactive about how we treat our kids.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. If any of you want to, or if all of you actually would be great, can go through and say what you would recommend to viewers to do to support youth at risk of incarceration, and what we as students perhaps could do to work on ending the detention of youth. Start with Vanessa.
I think that there is so much work to do in this area that it's almost impossible to even begin to narrow down the process. I think that one of the major first steps is education and connecting with organizations that work on these issues, and I think that can run the gamut from really working with community groups that are doing community-based support for young people and families. It can be direct services. It can be working with legal and policy organizations. But I think this is an area where there's so much work to be done that even just students volunteering time for research projects or supportive projects can be hugely beneficial to organizations and to the young people we're trying to serve.
Thank you.
I would say, we have intern spots, so, get involved, intern at organizations that are working on this issue, get involved with campaigns that are happening in your state, contact us at the campaign. We have swag. We will send it to you if you want to set up a table on campus, or you want a video to show, or you want somebody to talk, or even send fact sheets. We're happy to help and be connected to students in any way that you all find really helpful for us as a national organization to connect with you.
Thank you.
I think volunteer, be a mentor. I think there's been research out there that talks about kids having one positive adult, and sometimes it's a parent, sometimes they don't have that luxury. But we've seen I think Matt and I have seen coaches who have done that work for kids, or gang outreach workers, or other people like that. But I think being willing to commit to that kind of mentoring will be enormously helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, you kind of stole that. I
Sorry.
I wanted, I'd say with my clients, it's at least a year wait to work with a mentor, which means, tongue-in-cheek a little bit, but to say it's at least a year to wait before this child connects with an adult. There usually are adults who are trying to connect with the child who is at risk, yet for some reason it's not happening. If you are someone who can be a mentor for a teenage youth, trust me, you are really doing a lot of good to prevent a youth from coming back into the juvenile justice system or going in the first time. If you're really interested in what it's like at court and kind of in these cases, you could also consider becoming a court-appointed special advocate, which would focus more on child welfare issues, but there's a considerable amount of overlap, and they are involved in criminal cases as well. If you are a young or older adult and there is any way in which you think you can help children, trust me, we need it, and there is not enough of it, not enough help within the court system and within the juvenile justice system.
Thank you all. And then from my end too, the Student Alliance for Prison Reform, if there are students out there who are not a part of it, who want to start a chapter at their university, it's a really great student-run organization that does a lot of interesting demonstrations. We had a demonstration last semester called the 7x9 demonstration, in which students taped a 7x9 foot box to represent a solitary confinement cell, and students rotated every hour for 23 hours, remaining in that box, did not communicate with people outside, and had flyers out to bring awareness to the community about what solitary confinement looks like for youth. Tonight in Ohio, too, the Ohio State University Student Alliance for Prison Reform chapter is doing a demonstration on the unnecessary shackling of youth in court. And so that's being part of this alliance is another way to get involved on your campus. So for any students out there who are not involved and want to be, that is another great thing to be a part of. So I want to thank you all so much for being here tonight. I apologize for the technical difficulties at the beginning, and you all brought so much insight and shed so much light on this really terrible issue of youth being incarcerated in the criminal justice system. So I really appreciated it. I don't know if anyone has any last words to say, speak now, but otherwise I really appreciate it, and thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Have a good night.
Thanks,
Good
you too.
night.